Isn't that insane? Like how the world has gotten to that, especially at least in this field, in the professional writing and editing field. It's just it's a liability. Like it's a fucking liability to say what you think about a policy, about a
About
fucking
anything, and you have to pretend that this is like his, like, oh, it's always been this way. No, it has not.
right.
You're like, stop, like, I stop acting like this, like, was something that was written into the style guide or into the company handbook like 40 years ago. It is like this happened like 5 days ago, and you want me to adhere to this nonsense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's crazy, but that's where we are. And that's why I was like, I have to do podcasts like this. At the very least, it could make me lose everything, but then again, I always think like, okay, so they won't give me book deals, they won't give me teaching jobs, they won't give me awards. I'm like, well, I'm already not getting those things. Like they're not going to just give
I
them
mean,
to,
also, like, who
you know.
says that you're not getting? I mean, you will. Is there? I don't think you're blacklisted. I don't
No.
think there's a reason why, yeah, of like why you're not getting certain things,
Right,
except
yeah.
for I think like what we'll get into. I think there's just like a surplus of people, especially after the blogging boom in the 2010s, who were told that anybody could write, that anybody could do it. Um, yeah, like that. In a way, it was kind of true that like all it really took was savvy marketing, like good search engine optimization. Any like all you really had to have was media and internet savvy. It did not, or even just like great photography skills. And that was also true. You didn't. A lot of these early bloggers weren't really writers at all. They were just
Right.
very, very good at kind of beating Instagram to its game, like early on.
Yeah, and I would, yeah, I mean, I agree with that totally. Yeah, yeah, there are good parts where we kind of, yeah, anybody could do it. Anybody could do this now, but it's also the business model itself is drying up and all that. So yeah, I know it comes off when I talk about it sometimes as yeah, me being more like bitter or that like I'm thinking that like I'm being blacklisted or yeah, I don't think that at all. Yeah, out there listeners. I don't think that at all. I do I understand it's difficult too. Like I've been trying to get books published the last 4 years, and yeah, it hasn't happened. But like that's normal. Like that's the norm is trying for years to get your first shit out there. Like it's not just gonna be like, oh, you have a book, well, let's publish it right away. Nobody's gonna do that. Uh, but yeah, I am close. And when you and I have been chatting for a little bit now, and I am reaching that point where I'm close to giving up and being like, well, maybe I should just start like serializing some of the stuff I have on a Substack or like self-publish it or whatever. And I was like, well, you know who I would hire to edit? It would be Sam. It would be you. Yeah. Well, one, because
That
you're the
you
only one I know, but like still.
I don't think that's true either, but I'll take the compliment.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
I would have to
It
use
is.
your services. Yeah.
Oh no, but I will say that so one reason I'm sure you remember the freak out over Substack in 2021. So Substack now, like whoever I forgot who their director of partnerships is, but whoever they're doing is doing incredible work. They have brought almost every single person who was ever interesting, any sort of like interesting writer, in any genre, like across like not just media, but I think also just like literary, just authors. A lot of them have Substacks now, and I think as somebody, I think like who is it? Is it Sharman Alexi who is like serializing one of his novels on Substack? Like there are quite a few people doing that now. But I think you remember the freak out from a long time ago, and it was just like, oh my God, like it's becoming a hub of fascism because like they will refuse it, like. Because one of the key tenets was, free speech rules always.
Right.
And, that free speech kind of like freewheeling culture is what produced some of the first Substack pro people, not just, Michael Tracy, who I work for, but Matt Iglesias is one of the only people to kind of like go from the 2000s blogging boom into Substack. But he went from blogging at Center for American Progress, Think Progress, to doing what he is now. He was one of the first people offered a deal, and then you had Andrew Sullivan, who, you know, he was at New York Magazine during 2020, treated terribly, was given a deal, I believe. I'm not sure. But I think that's kind of what the freak out was all about. All these people who, you know, they're very talented, more senior colleagues, kind of legitimize their position. Like, it was prestigious to work at a certain outlet because you had someone like a luminary working above you, or you had someone editing you that was just, you know, maybe that's what drew you to the place. But then now, you know, when a lot of those people started migrating over to Substack, they, you know, it was like, oh my God. And like, and I kind of get it, because before it was like, you had these people who would be bringing in all these, like, who would be bringing in revenue, subscriptions for the parent outlet, and they broke off on their own. And then also you had like people like who I work for, just kind of iconoclasts who managed to stay afloat on their own and contribute and build a life for years, like despite all of the backbiting, despite all of the, you know, like maybe he's too controversial, we don't want to publish him. And he has a massive platform. And it's not because, you know, he's a fascist or whatever. It's because like, or you know, and like, yes, I understand that some of these people can like have very spicy takes, but it's not even because of that. He was able to kind of do that because he was doing kind of like what that article said, the Nylon article, even though he's not an it guy or a literary it girl. He was able to, you know, build an audience like from an unusual method, and then use that to springboard into serious journalism.
Yeah. Would you say that like I'm not part, I mean, obviously there's political angles to why people were freaking out about Substack, but would you say it was more like I think the political arguments against Substack were hysteria? The more real reason that people were upset was the business. That was like the last nail in the coffin of like the old business model for magazines and new papers, at least.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, I kind of have a scrambled timeline now, but I think
we all
around,
do, Sam. Yeah, we all
no,
do,
no,
yeah.
but like at this point, I think like around that time, there were, you know, another round of layoffs, and like at maybe HuffPost somewhere, and then another round of layoffs somewhere else. So, you know, while these people who are supposedly, you know, they're publishing wrong speak, they're doing things that you're not supposed to be doing, and all this, and, you know, all these people had kind of built brands, not off of doing that, but like by being original thinkers for decades. They were like, okay, well, fine. You know, this new company came and they gave me a contract like for a year, and they all left. And then, yeah, I think that's exactly what the freak out was. It's like in a time with all these mass layoffs, like some of these young reporters, some of whom are like, I'm going to enter a word in here, some of whom were woke. You know, they're, you know, like their etiquette that they just kind of like sprung on some of these places, it didn't work anymore. Like they didn't have that power over their senior colleagues anymore. And their work was kind of delegitimized because the people who made those outlets great were leaving. So yeah, like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hear, listeners, you hear the voice of our guest today here, giving us a rundown of what you can expect here as we get into this episode of Heavy Board. And welcome to it. I'm Andrew Wittstadt. And I'm joined today by a special guest, Sam, who's come here to talk about Ottessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And I think we have the same version of this because this book's so popular, right? So whatever I do on the rundown here is I always just like, you know, what version we read, the publisher stuff for the book nerds. Yeah, I got the same one, the kind of mass market paperback. Published by Penguin Books in 2018 originally, right? But this version was published in 2019. And we're going to get into it here today, listeners. And I always like to just kind of start with, you know, your experience with this book, kind of your history with this book or Ottessa or literature in general. You know, just give listeners kind of an overview of, before we even get into the book, really, just like your history of it.
Came out in 2018. I kind of hesitated to buy it. At the time I was living in the New York area. I remember seeing it in the window of McNally Jackson, and like a lot of my friends were reading it, and they were like, you should read it. But I didn't want to because I had read the blurb on the back of the book, and I thought, okay, I'm not ready for this yet. It's a bit too biographical, maybe. So, so like the protagonist in the book, I also spent kind of like, I had a 6-month period of rest and relaxation, you could call it that, on the Upper East Side in Yorkville, maybe a block away from where wherever she lives. And a lot of these, experiences I remember having. I remember just I could see Carl Schurz Park from my window. I could kind of see Roosevelt Island. And I remember like waking up and seeing the Brearley girls go to school and thinking how old I was and just like how ancient. At the time I had taken, I graduated college a little bit later, and I had to take some time off just to kind of deal with a physical disability. At the time I was subletting this place uptown. And I just remember just kind of feeling numb. I had this vision of like, just like scribbling, like writing, like as the sun was pouring into my like white box and that I was renting. And I thought it was going to be like, the start of a new life. And it really was not. It was more like a purgatory time for me to get organized. So I didn't want to read this at the very beginning because I was like, oh God, like I don't want to think about that time when like I was probably not the greatest friend to some of the people who cared about me, or like when I basically was just like, I was sitting there watching like dopey TV shows and like kind of thinking like, oh gosh, like what am I going to do after this? Like I've got 6 months before I go back to school. I can figure things out. So that's my history with it. But then when I finally read it, I was very stunned. Like I was very impressed. I thought that, so something that I kind of get from a lot of these books that take place in New York and they're written by millennial women is there's always, maybe it's because, Ottessa is a very different author. So she has this kind of like deadpan, unembellished prose, and that made me appreciate it, because usually what you get with these is the protagonist kind of like makes it a point to signal something, like either I don't belong of this culture, of this city, or there's some sort of just like waving, like they break the fourth wall somehow, or they like wink at the reader a bit, like like, well, this isn't me, and like she doesn't do that. It's darkly hilarious, and like there's a lot of like she's sending up a certain kind of culture that was present, in the very like late 90s, early 2000s, but it's just not in your face. And I think that that's what makes it different from a lot of the books released during this time.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel the same way. And we were chatting a little bit about, and I want to get to this, about how this book was kind of a breath of fresh air reading it compared to like all the other kind of contemporary novels and stuff that come out. And regular listeners to this will know that I do not keep up with the latest and greatest kind of stuff that comes out. It's just too much for me. So like if something gets a reputation and then I'm like, okay, I'm interested, so I only knew the book by reputation as like, this is Ottessa's big hit. This is her big kind of, she had couple books before this, but this was her big kind of like breakthrough into the mainstream and all that, and everybody talking about her book and her stories, and made her career, I guess you could say, although she had a career before this. But yeah, so I only knew it from reputation. And then, the next question is usually, how did it read for you? Just impressions.
I mean, it was, I reread it again before coming on here, and I forgot how just like delightful it is, and just how close that she truly understands, I don't want to say that she experienced it, but she understands that feeling of kind of like being numb, being in purgatory. Like just even like the prose is very like just on the page. It was a very easy read. It was a smooth read. And it, these days I feel like there's a lot of just kind of, I like purple prose that takes me out of writing. Like it's overly descriptive. This was just like, I was very like within like the first couple of chapters or like first couple of pages, or like, I was right there, like in the protagonist, like, badly decorated apartment, like on that Pottery Barn couch, the sweat stains, like with like videos going in the background.
Yeah, and I will say, I guess it's uniquely millennial in that way, even though I guess it's talking about a time. If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard. I guess there were some millennials that were approaching like their 20s at the new millennium.
Where the generation starts. It starts in 1981, and then it ends with my year. No, a year after me, 1994.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So that's like, yeah, and I mean, it does capture something. And I guess the Gen Xers did this too. Like the Gen X writers that were the first ones to kind of talk about that numbness, the kind of disappointment in the things you're not supposed to be disappointed in, like the things you're supposed to be excited about and like looking forward to, and you should be happy, right?
Association. Yeah.
It's just so it's interesting that the last 2 generations that are, at least that are adults now, and I guess Gen Z is just becoming these adults here. We're the ones that felt this. Like, you never saw like boomers or the silence being like, oh, I'm miserable because everything's just boring. It was like, I'm miserable because I'm in poverty or because of the Great War or like whatever it is, or Vietnam or something. But like here it's just like, everything's great and I'm bored. Like, it's very unique. Yeah, sorry.
It is. No. I was going to say, I don't even think like it's very clear that it isn't just because she's bored. It's because that like she was expecting meaning out of things, especially after kind of having this, I guess, tough childhood where there wasn't much of anything. Like she had all the status markers, and she had just kind of like her best friend Reva says, like she has all this stuff that's supposed to make her happy, but she's not, because I mean, at the time, I think like it kind of, symbolizes the beginning of a zeitgeist in a decade. That was kind of the complaint about the 2000s, right? That, it was like raunch culture and everything was superficial and plasticky, and like the entire zeitgeist was kind of like a bright pink, like a hot pink, like the cover, not a millennial
Right.
pink. Like it was a very, it was a different time. Like when people kind of like reminisce on the 2000s now, like my siblings who wear Y2K stuff, or they talk about, like, of course they don't remember because they were born in the 2000s. I think that like they forget like why we landed in our wretched decade now. It's because, really, because for a long time, I think especially like leading up to 2008, like that was the complaint from everyone. Like everything is too superficial. Everything is just kind of like hard and like shock. Like if you hit something, it will bounce back at you. It was very much like no one like had any regard for the future, and like the past is just like an afterthought. Everyone was just kind of like going. It was a very materialistic decade. I think that she kind of captures that very well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, without like being obvious about it, but you just kind of see like how like these people who were born in the early 80s, how they came of age. I think this is something like we didn't experience.
Yeah, because I guess at the year this takes place, it takes place from like 2000 to 2001, basically, right? Like, and I guess for me, I would have been in middle school at that time, like 11, 12, the 9/11, I was in 6th grade, Miss Magar's English class when the towers went down, and then they made the announcement, like all that. But yeah, I mean, and I think there's some confusion about it now too. Hindsight's, it's always easier to look back and like, oh, that decade had a lot of numbness to it, even though we kind of are nostalgic for it now, just because everything's so censorious or oppressive in certain ways, and it's unique ways that they're doing that it is in this culture now. But it is like, I think, she's not the first writer to write about that period. Or maybe she was like the first to get a huge, big, popular book from it in recent years. But there's a couple now that I've noticed, like a couple books that have come out recently that are about that year, like the 1999 to like 2001 era. Like people are just like really nostalgic for that time right now. And I guess it's okay. It's 20 years removed, so it makes sense that it's coming back a little bit with trends and things like that. But yeah, it
doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that might be another. I think I talked about this recently with a friend. Like a lot of what's happening then is sort of happening now, except that we don't like have the same distractions or even culture now. Like if I were Generation Z and we're about to approach a war, maybe, and we're seeing the phrase "axis of evil" pop up again, I would want what we had then versus what we have now. I would want, the auto-tuned pop music and less internet, less social media, so you're not seeing all of this play out all the time.
Right.
I would want just kind of that. I wouldn't just call it carefree, but just, I don't know what you would call it. Someone called it just like unhinged capitalism, but that just sounds pretentious and weird. But I guess just like a sort of materialism and like apolitical environment that just, shadowed over all of this.
Yeah. And I always point to social media, I guess, being the thing. I guess that's the big thing people are reaching, but it's hard to write about this time right now. It's hard. So if she were to set this in present day or, a couple years ago, it's really hard to write about, maybe because of what we're living through being so absurd and so obsessed with, like the political angle first and foremost on all fronts, which is really the issue. And that's, most listeners to this know, like I come at it from that angle, whereas I'm like, the politics isn't necessarily the problem. It's the emphasis on politics that's the problem. It's the putting that before anything else, whether we're talking about visual art, literary art, like any movies, TV shows. It just, that's a forced framework that I'm just desperate to get everybody to see, to be like, we don't have to put the politics first. Like always exceptions for books that are explicitly political, that if it's written into the book or it's in the project or the art piece, of course you have to talk politics, but it just, it becomes first and foremost, and it makes it so that everybody's a little on edge, and it's the tension. It's the tension that everybody feels right now. It's the main source of any disagreement right now is political, and it's just, and especially in the writing world, I think people like to deny it. They like to pretend it's not as bad as it is. Whereas like we're in full blown Red Scare territory, basically, like, and we've been there for a few years now. Like, but I guess the good news is we do see it kind of shifting away a little bit. And I think writers like Ottessa are part of the reason that's happening, like, because she's just consistently refused to engage with that kind of stuff and just be like, no, I don't have to engage with politics first. I'm going to do the writing first, the story first. And then, people can say what they say. And just having a big writer, a big, great American writer saying that over and over again and not budging, even though she's, she's like hardline on it or anything. She's never been like, I refuse, but just casually doing it, just the way she does it. Like we need that. We need good American writers to just not do it, just not participate in the politics first and just do their thing. And the more that happens, the more we're going to see, I like to think that we're going to start moving away from this bullshit and get to, more people like Ottessa writing more books like this that are great and fun and cool and a little bit edgy, a little bit provocative. Like this used to be the norm. And I said to you when we were chatting, and I said in the beginning of this episode, listeners, like it was refreshing to read this book. It felt like I was reading a book from like 20, 30 years ago almost. Like that was my first impressions, like first couple chapters. I'm like, whoa, this thing feels like it's from another era. And I get she's setting it in the 20 years ago, but it's like, this is how books always used to be. They always used to be a little bit funny, a little bit edgy, a little bit provocative, maybe a little racy in some scenes, some hot sex scenes or whatever people like get uneasy about or whatever. And it just used to be the norm, and everybody just knew that novels were supposed to be this. They were supposed to be refreshing, provocative, interesting, titillating in these weird, almost even taboo ways. And it was okay because it's just a book it's just words on a page. It's just a fucking book. And like this is how we get so that we just do this. And I think the fact that she's just did it unapologetically is just great. And she deserves all her praise, listeners, Sorry, I've been talking for a while, yeah.
Well, I was just agreeing with what you said. It's very raw, and I think one other thing that maybe people are not used to, I noticed this, is it's kind of detached. People might disagree with that interpretation, but I think what we've had maybe for almost 10 years, 8 years, and it was brought about maybe by Lena Dunham and Girls, I'm not sure, But
I really like that. Yeah, I like that.
What?
The idea that it might have Lena Dunham and girls changed the detachment. Sorry, keep going, but I'll follow up.
No, for sure. So, but yeah, I think what happened is they saw that, and then all of a sudden, just oversharing about everything became the norm, especially even in literature, like even in just fiction. You know, all of a sudden, like it wasn't just online confessionals or like fun kind of gross out BuzzFeed articles. It wasn't just that anymore. Lena Dunham, I guess, found a way to intellectualize that, but I think a lot of people didn't realize that that's just who she is, the person. Like that's just what her work has always been like, because that's who she is. So that's what really kind of struck me. Usually I feel like this would be like a full blown confessional, and like she would just be like, if Lena wrote this, or if any like one of the crop of other kind of contemporary fiction writers wrote this book, I think you would get that more. You would get, it would be a lot sloppier and warmer, maybe. It wouldn't be cool and detached. And like there's a part where she's describing, I mean, like every time that she describes going into her like sleep hypnotist, basically, it's just completely like you feel like she's watching herself do it. It's very clinical. It's very like it's very crisp and deadpan and just like unadorned. And I can't remember the last time I read anything like that. Right.
And just like the detachment, like you were mentioning, like we've already said it's very millennial. Yeah, it is. And then I think the comparison to girls is accurate. It's important, I think. And I everybody says this, especially in some of the circles, that we hang out in and stuff. Some of the circles that like how we got to know each other, everybody's obsessed with girls, and for good reason. It was a very pivotal show, and I remember watching it when it was airing and loving it. And Dunham captured that millennial ethos, like to the men and women. Like people think, oh, it's just girls because, it was the five main characters were all like this group of friends, but like the boyfriends, like they captured the, like Adam Driver, captured the kind of quirky New York, like millennial boy. It kind of just, it captured what everybody was doing, this oversharing. And like you said, it's confessional in the kind of the tradition of confessional poetry and literature that we've had for, like almost 100 years now, listeners. But it's like, it does make it, it's not just that. It's not just like this kind of secrets, or she's telling some deep dark secret or whatever. She's like you said, almost removed from it in a way to where it's like the character's almost judging herself too, like as you're reading through the narrator in the fictionalized version. I know, like, we do poetry and fiction on this podcast. I know the poets that listen to this know that it's a taboo to assume that the speaker is the writer, right? Like, or the narrator is the writer. So poets are well versed in that. But I know fiction, there's this tendency to always be like, well, it's the writer. She's writing exactly about herself. And it's like, well, not exactly, right? Like, she's a little removed from it, and we don't know. Maybe there's pieces that were biographical, but we don't know, And it's bad to assume it, but yeah. There's the first thing I stood out was because it opens on and about her like kind of job in the art world, right? Like the New York visual art scenes, to be specific, listeners, and it's kind of always been a ripe area for satire in literature. Like, you go back like several decades and everybody's kind of talking about, like how kind of stupid and ridiculous it is, and all these rich people that have no taste and are just spending millions on like garbage art. And Sam's nodding along and she's like, yeah, I lived it, bro. yeah, absolutely. And just like one of the descriptions on page 33, first full paragraph on page 33 there, which she's just kind of describing the art cowards that like the main character is disgusted by.
I don't know if that's 33 in mine. On 33 in mine, she's talking about, and this is what I actually really appreciated, because I feel like she's the only person to do this honestly and without any sort of like trace of resentment. She's talking about lit rose with air quotes. Like, I feel like this is a trope that I constantly gets rehashed every 4 months about David Foster Wallace and these guys. And I'm just going to say it. Do I like these guys? Absolutely not. I do not like these guys. This is the first time that someone has actually said, or given a valid reason for them. It's not just like, oh God, like they're just so pretentious with their like he walked in wearing like a beanie and carrying infinite, like instead of just like having this image or like just a trope that people haven't experienced. I feel like most people who complain about these guys have never actually, you know, experienced these guys. They just know that they're supposed to dislike these guys. You kind of have this brilliant paragraph, like a brilliant graph in the middle of the page.
It's totally true. And the part I was going to read was just that first two sentences.
Please do it.
The worst was that those guys tried to pass off their insecurity as sensitivity, and it worked. They would be the ones running museums and magazines, and they'd only hire me if they thought I might fuck them. And I was just like laughing to this because it does capture that scene that the insecurity as sensitivity is one of the most, like, I guess I'll call it a truism, because like it captures that kind of, as someone who was a former sad art boy kind of, or that's, you know, teen years to early 20s coming into this scene, she captures it. She knows Ottessa's been around these people, and like, yeah, like you can just, there's something fake about it always. There's something that's like a little bit performative, and it's all about this kind of deep-seated insecurity and blah blah blah, you know, you know, whatever. But yeah,
it's why she even says why. And I think it's because I think a lot of these guys, it's not just for the love of books, it's not just for the love of art. They kind of form their identities in opposition to someone else who they always kind of see as their permanent antagonist. And she says that on the page before it. You know, I'll read from it actually.
Yes, please.
Yeah. All right. So I think in the middle of the page, an alternative to the mainstream frat boys and pre-med straight and narrow guys, these scholarly, charmless, intellectual brats dominated the more creative departments. As an art history major, I couldn't escape them. Like, yes, I think, yeah. Dudes reading on the subway, reading Proust, reading David Foster Wallace, jotting down their brilliant thoughts in a black moleskin pocket notebook. Beer bellies and skinny legs, zip-up hoodies, navy blue peacoats, and army green parkas. Like,
it's incredible.
It's the first time when I've seen the trope, and it's like, you know that it isn't born out of resentment or even, you know, and it's every time I hear someone complain about these guys, it's like, I don't think you've actually experienced this. I don't think you've been on a date with one of these guys. I don't even think you've been in a workshop with one of these guys. I think you just know that you're supposed to dislike them. She gets it. Like, she knows why I think the original trope came around. Yeah. You know,
and that hits. It does hit because it hits that truism, that little bit of that kernel of truth that we always seeking in fiction and things like that. Yeah, like, and it kind of even describes, you know, I bring up Lindy Man stuck culture or whatever. It does describe this kind of stuck, like, because this same person still exists. They're still reading the same books on the subway, right? Like, they're still trying to pass off their insecurity as sensitivity. You know, like, they're still trying. They're, like she says, that one, afraid of their own dicks, afraid of themselves. And it does capture a certain millennial male psyche, I think, where there is these levels of insecurity that nobody talks about because, you know, there's a bunch of reasons for that, I guess, but it is kind of, there's a uniquely male insecurity wrapped up in that. I think that she's just putting her finger on in this nice long description that you heard Sam read and I read parts of it. It's a couple paragraphs here. It's just a great section there in that chapter. Just the fact that the navy blue peacoats in that article that came out, we're recording this on October 26th, listeners, and that article that came out, I guess, was it a couple weeks ago now, maybe a week ago, with the David Foster Wallace. It was just another one of the, basically, David Foster Wallace sucks and the men who like him suck, and it almost seems like they lifted it out of this chapter, the navy blue peacoat specifically, because it was referenced in that latest DFW piece, and everyone was just like, who even wears navy blue peacoats anymore?
We're at the point where, I mean, I will say that, I mean, there's a word for this, and I'm not, but it seems like all of these tropes are now just like being strung together and revived by people who know nothing else. Like, I have seen, you know, people kind of act this out, like, you know, would-be lit bros who haven't read David Foster Wallace. Like, things are a little bit different now in English programs and MFA programs. Like, I don't know what they'd be wearing. I don't know, like some like hype beast brand hoodie maybe. I don't know. I have no idea. But, you know, I'm thinking of like a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old here, someone about my brother's age. But it just seems like, again, like, I do think they might have lifted this. Like, they know that there's someone, like some of these like women who are on Book Top writing these articles that they're supposed to hate, or someone who they're supposed to define themselves in opposition to, and like, who better than these guys? And I do get it. It's just that, the guy has changed and evolved a bit, and I think that the literary landscape, which people say is very female dominated now, and it is, I think a lot of it actually kind of came about because of these guys. I don't think it was entirely down to some of the women in publishing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think there is, like, people tend to forget that too, because we are so many years removed from maybe like the turn of the century there, but there's always a reaction. There's a reason people are reacting. Even now you see people reacting, like, it's not usually because of nothing, although sometimes it is now with social media and the propaganda that gets spread everywhere. But like, yeah, it's always a reaction. There's something that causes, for every action, there's equal opposite reaction, right? Like, there's just something that happens, and this is true for culture, trends in publishing, writing, art making. Like, there's always a reaction. I'm going on a podcast tomorrow. Somebody asked me on to talk about, it's nerdy poetry stuff, but like, and we're going to, he prepped me on basically what we're going to go into is, these kind of evolution of trends throughout. And how the novel affected poetry basically in the 20th century and all that, and how people write it. It's just a reaction, like people rejecting the generation before them, like rejecting, like the boomers rejecting the modernists and stuff, and the, that era, and the silent generation. And yeah, it's just normal part of it. And there is that kind of reaction to that was the dominant presence at the time in the early 2000s, was that David Foster Wallace loving, mostly male, even though it was starting to become more female and more parody at that time in the industry, it was still dominated by that type of guy. And then obviously there was a huge reaction that lasted a decade or two to that. But I always say, like, my friend who I've had on this podcast before, shout out to Lee, listeners, go listen to Lee Madeline's episode here and buy her book. She loves DFW, and she always talks about this because she's a huge fan, and she's a woman that's a huge fan of him. And she always kind of rolls her eyes at those articles that come out every 4 or 5 months. I'll send her a text whenever they come out, and we'll chat about it a little bit. And she's just saying, like, people, when she lived in New York and was working in publishing, she always told on that episode, listeners, go listen to it. She was saying that, like, everyone around her at the publishing house and stuff were like, oh my God, avoid guys like that that just bring up DFW on a date, and that's all they want to talk about. And she just said, like, that never happened to her. Like, she's like, I don't think I ever sat across the table from a guy on a date where that happened. She's like, but for some reason, everyone around me was acting as if this happened all the time. And this was like, I think by the time she was doing that was like 2010, 2011, like in New York, and the kind of the publishing scene. And she was just like, I don't know, like, is it an older trope that still exists, or I guess is what I'm getting at, or if it's even fucking real, is it just like a fake thing at this point? Or like you said, with the kind of it's kind of a revival here where people are starting to get this kind of dude bro, they call it, or bro lit, or whatever phrase you want to use. There's starting to be a little bit more of a revival of that, because it's been 20 years of reaction against that, and now it's like, okay, of course it's going to go in cycles. But yeah, really good point, Sam. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to like start chatting, but yeah, this is why Sam came on. Yeah.
No, I agree with everything you said. I think that's a good point. But I also was going to say that I don't know who David Foster Wallace was, forming a reaction to, because sometimes when I read people and they talk about the publishing industry, I'm just like, what was I reading? I think it was like a Lid Hub piece, or maybe a Book Riot piece, and it was from a long time ago. But it was they were talking about, like, as if it were still maybe like the late mid-century, like when they were talking about it being an old boys club, and I was like, okay, so I can think of James Wiley, or is that his name? It's not Robert, it's Andrew Wiley. Sorry, yes. So we've got one geriatric on deck. Like who are the other who is left from this culture of like St. Paul's to the Ivy League to the publishing house? I want to know who these people are that are apparently among us, because I cannot think of one person who wasn't gone, forced out, retired. I don't know what they're talking about, but I do think that those people who did exist, that might be who these quote unquote like these lit bros are reacting to. They wanted to have a different, and then also, I mean, I do think that sure, David Foster Wallace had some problematic elements, but a lot of these writers, and I think this is what's also new and like why things are sterile, a lot of writers aren't upstanding citizens. Like we're kind of any artist is not. Like it isn't until recently that you had this, and I think it was Tina Fey or maybe it was Amy Poehler who said it. A lot of like guys in their I guess in their era who went into comedy, they were like Norm Macdonald, or like they were like quote unquote like fail sons. They kind of like drifted around. They were edgy, they were angry, they had a large chip on their shoulder, and comedy was sort of their outlet. And then meanwhile, the women who went into comedy, they were always great citizens, like kind of, Tina Fey called herself like a drug-free, achievement-oriented virgin, adult virgin. Like they were great daughters. They made dean's list every semester. They were kind of like, they were very goody-goody and almost uptight, and like comedy was their way to let loose. And I think that's the thing. Like, I see this trend remarked on a lot. Like Megan McArdle, who works for the Washington Post, said that, and you kind of see it a bit here in Ottessa's book. Like the protagonist gets into Columbia by writing like this, unreadable essay about like, it's just like a bad prompt about, I think, like technology and art. I forgot the name. I have to go back into the book, but it was like very unreadable. It sounded almost like some of the semiotic work that came out during that time. And that was the path that Megan McArdle said she took. She was like, I wasn't a straight A kid. I wasn't like, I had a high SAT score, but I was an underachiever. And, I was too busy writing opinion columns for my local newspaper and, slacking off to do homework. And I got into Penn anyway, and like, right. It wasn't, and like her parents weren't particularly rich. They weren't donor class people. But I think, she clearly is a brilliant person, and she managed to kind of like make her career just through writing. And I think like you see that in the protagonist too. It was like, I like walked my way into Columbia. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
And I think like that also, I mean, people say, and I think in a way that is good. Like I think meritocracy is good, but I think that's also what kind of brought us this new class of writers and artists who are maybe more like what Tina and Amy say they were, like very just like, great, like upright, uptight people, right, who like let loose through comedy and, really found their voices through comedy, or like through another dimension, or like through art. They were a different kind of person.
Absolutely. And there is that, and it's become more in the discussion like the last 100 years, basically, or last 50, 70 years, with class and writers and all that, and how it affects, people will be like, oh, if you're a lower class person or you were raised lower class, your family had less money for education and all these things, like, kind of the striver class of people, upper middle class to upper class. If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard. And it just, they're telling me how the lower classes have a harder time getting in, and that's true, but it is also like, it's a recent thing, because I always like to say, like, people look back at the canon and be like, oh, well, all these people were wealthy with trust funds. It's like, yes, they were, because before like 1950, like industrialization, if you didn't have a trust fund, like if you weren't from a rich family or something, you didn't have time to sit around and contemplate life and write these like modernist style texts. Like they were all wealthy from wealthy families because nobody had time. They were like working their ass off, to survive. And more recently, you could be getting in from a lower class, but it's still the same thing. Like it's still the same. Who buys the most books? Well, the middle, upper classes. Like that's who buys the most books. And it just, I don't know. I guess they're just, my point is just that it's always looked at the wrong way when you start twisting these kind of classes as to who's allowed to write about books or characters or different classes of people or anything like that. But you also made a good point about that kind of the anger that these, particularly the Gen X and I think millennial and even I think Zoomers, although it's very repressed in Zoomers here, the anger that a lot of young men have, and it's for no reason. Like there's no good reason for young men to be that angry, but they are. And I remember it very well when my phase of it came through. It's those teenage years into your early 20s. You are incredibly pissed, and there's no reason for it, like usually, but it's just I don't know why. And then you find these different things. So I heard a few smart people talking about, the kind of new metal when we were growing up, the kind of corns, the stuff that was coming out, all that kind of rap metal, very angry. Teenage boys loved it, right? Because it was just a place for them to go in and they could just mosh or something, like push people around, and it was fine. It wasn't like a destructive thing. Although I guess some people did get hurt in those pits. There's always the horror stories of those concert pits. You never want to wear flip flops to one of the one of those. You get a broken toe. I remember I was at a Modest Mouse. This is completely unrelated. I was at a Modest Mouse show once, and I love Modest Mouse is my favorite band. Like I fucking worship Isaac Brock. Although I admit their last couple albums, they've fallen off. They're almost 50 now. They're old, but
no, but I love them too, and I listened to them religiously for a long time. Yes.
Yeah, and they were playing a set, and this was actually in DC. I was at 930 Club in DC because I was still living in Baltimore at the time. And I went with a bunch of friends and my wife. We weren't married at the time, but we were dating still at that time. And it was like all these people, they started playing dance hall. And so I went nuts and started dancing around. That's only like a 40-second like little thing they were doing on stage. And then everybody around me, this one guy's like, "Oh, I'm in flip-flops, man. Like, come on, blah, blah." And I just stopped. And I looked at him. I was a little drunk. I was like, "I don't give a fuck." I was like, "Get in the back. Get in the back if you have flip-flops on, you motherfucker." Like, and I guess I'm a little intimidating when I'm like talk to people when I was like drunk.
No, for sure. Yeah.
But and he just kind of shut up after that. I was like, "Yeah, don't fucking talk to me, bitch. Like your fucking flip-flops. Oh, my toes."
How old were you? When was this?
Probably like 24, probably.
Okay,
almost like 10 years ago, yeah. Just a dumb, angry kid. Yeah, that just like, "Don't you fucking tell me anything. Get out of my face." But yeah, it's
just like a Modest Mouse concert, like of all things. I think I just have other, I guess, albums of theirs in my head. Like you mentioned them, it's been such a long time. I do love them, and I thought randomly of like, Wild Packs of Family Dogs or like something like
so
that.
Important.
To mosh. I was like, what? What are they moshing to? Like, of course it would be what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I was.
And some of their earlier stuff, like before that, before the Moon in Antarctica, when they had that really kind of Seattle grungy punk influence to where they were just kind of lo-fi 4-track recorders in a shed in that trailer park. Yeah, they have some more like kind of punky shit to mosh to.
Speaking of like what we were talking about with, I guess, like stereotypes being reified, I saw somebody the other day, like kind of one of the same kind of people who like to talk about Lit Rose talking about Modest Mouse, and I laughed. I had to admit, it was like you can really tell when Modest Mouse stopped doing heroin. Like that's why the last couple albums were so bad. I was like, oh god, like
yeah. And I'm a millennial, so I didn't even when the first couple albums dropped in like 97 or whatever, like I wasn't listening to them then. I was like 8 years old. Like I wasn't listening to indie experimental rock, but and I came to it later. So like people shit on them for the Good News for People Who Love Bad News, the Float On, and then the We Were Dead. But like those are the first 2 albums I came to, and I fucking love them. Like I think they're great. Like, and even that, it has a little bit of that apathy to it. It has a little bit of that kind of Gen X millennial kind of numbness to like a lot of those lyrics, a lot of those songs, a lot of the kind of even this is the weird experimental stuff. And they weren't the only band doing that, but they did become like kind of the most mainstream that did that. But yeah, I'm glad Modest Mouse got brought up. I like, I say listeners guest, when you're a guest on here, just bring up everything that I love. Yeah, Modest Mouse, Vonnegut. Like,
I'm glad to hear that you're a fan. It's just funny, like what they, I guess for me, because I was younger than you were, like when they came out or like when I started listening to them, it was usually in conjunctions with bands of their polar opposites. Like OAR would be on the playlist next to Modest Mouse, like you hear like some like absolute, I think like so much, it'd be like some very reflective song that maybe was like off of one of their other albums, not Good News from Blah, Blah, but like So Much Beauty and Dirt. It'd be that next to like, like what's that song? Like that was a crazy game of poker where it's like a 7-minute cut of like, and I said, Johnny, what you doing? Like it'd be next to that. It was like, right next to Modest Mouse, which was experimental rock kind of grunge. You'd have this preppy band that came out the same, like what that kind of emerged or like became popular at the same time that they went mainstream. So they were grouped under that for some strange reason.
And I know Modest, just because of the Seattle, they got grouped in with like Elliott Smith and stuff when they were coming out, like this kind of, for some reason, like it just all this scene was being, I guess maybe that's why people are nostalgic for it. We're talking about the kind of turn of the millennium. Modest Mouse was dropping albums. Elliott Smith was dropping his albums, like these kind of huge icons in the music scene that are still huge. And just, maybe that's it. Just subconsciously, I associate that time with like the Elliott Smith and the Modest Mouse and then all the pop that was coming out that was very rock focused before we switched to the electronic music. I think like even Madonna's hits, Britney's hits, all these pop stars, they all had the kind of a like old school rock pop kind of aspect to them before it started to transition, and maybe that's part of the nostalgia too. I don't know, but
like those songs were just so, I mean, that kind of, I've heard like that bubblegum kind of, I've heard people call it bitchy pop. And it's like, I feel like that's almost disappeared. Like sometimes I think maybe like Rihanna put out some bitchy pop, maybe like a couple albums ago, or like maybe like 2013, like whatever that album of hers was, with like Cake on it. I think that was probably like her bitch, or no, it was Loud. That was her bitchy pop album, maybe. But people kind of miss that, like that kind of just, I think at the time the critique was like, oh, this isn't even music, like it's meaningless, it's just like something bass and I can hear the auto tune. And I think like that kind of is what people needed during a time when, after 9/11 and we were at war and you didn't want things to be just like to feel everything. If you were someone who read like Matt Taibbi back then, and this is why I laugh at people's depiction of him now, you were probably, you were a freak. You like nobody else is doing that, at least in my area. Like you were like, kind of numbing yourself. You were nodding along to like these auto-tune songs in your car. Maybe you were listening to Modest Mouse and whatnot, but then you were probably also reading Taibbi. Like there was a distinct subculture that all that was a part of. And the mainstream culture, like the monoculture, was very, it was not serious. It was not intellectual. That was the critique everybody had. It was mass produced. It was Howard Stern talking about like making borderline like sexual, I don't know, almost sexually harassing people on air, but nobody cared. Like
right. Yeah, I like that you bring up Taibbi too. Are you a big Taibbi?
I mean, I've always read him, and I'd say that I definitely am a fan of his. But it's just very funny to see. He was one of the very first people to start writing on Substack.
Right.
And and I actually have I haven't interacted with him before, but he was, I think, like his reporting, like he was like one of the few like gonzo journalists who to really do it in the modern era.
Right.
Like his Rolling Stone reporting really defined that. And now I think a lot of the people who now slam him are trying to, they're trying to replicate that. They're trying to copy that. But they don't have the element that he had at the time. I don't even think he has that element anymore. It's just a very different, the culture has switched. What are you pushing back against now when so-called counterculture is mainstream and nerdy, like different people took it over. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I like that you say that too. Like the nerdiness. My favorite Taibbi era is the pre-Rolling Stone era. And again, I wasn't reading it at the time because I was too young, but like I give my students this essay almost every year here. I do change it up, but his one about why sports are for losers that he wrote for like Men's Journal, in like 2004 or something, like 2002 or something. And he was writing for all those men's magazines, and he's writing about like how hot Anna Kournikova is and like all that. Like it was just great stuff. And I always give my students that one, to why sports are for losers, because it usually gets quite a reaction, from the men, especially in the room, the kind of who, it's always interesting. You see a student, especially a male student, that would not very interested, they're going through the class, but they're not like, passionate or anything. And then you give them that Taibbi essay, kind of, it's usually around the third essay, I'll give it to them, and the reactions that you'll see them light up a little bit, usually because they want to argue against it. They want to say, well, I like, baseball, or I like basketball, I was like, yeah, tell me more, like they get kind of animated about it. I'm like, yeah, only Taibbi could. And, Taibbi's a huge sports guy, loves sports. And then, but he just wrote this great kind of piece, 25 years ago, and it still holds up. It's great. Yeah. Hard to find though. I have to like keep a PDF of it because like the old website or something, like the archives, you have to go through like.
To me, I don't have it. Like I used to have like one of the first issues of N+1, here in like my little like apartment. I don't have that anymore. Yeah, please send me that PDF. I'd love to have that just in the archives.
Yeah, I know you and I chatted about N+1 before too. You've mentioned N+1 and. Just kind of when you and I were chatting and we're just kind of, lamenting the state of literary magazines and things like that. And yeah, like how important those kind of magazines like N+1 were. And at that era too, like at that era where the first internet magazines were starting to pop up. And with that, the literary magazines and fuck yeah. Shit, we're going so far off of it too, but
there's a way to circle it back. In fact, I was just thinking about it.
Please.
When my year of rest and relaxation talks about, Dupont the art gallery, of course, like you were saying, like it's like ripe for satire. It's such a it's like, oh my God, like I know these people, I've lived it, but at the same time, you can kind of see that, there was a bit. If it didn't work out there, like if she didn't go into like her, year of sleeping, either there was something of value produced, or like there was always a new gallery or a new venture being started. Like at that point, the city, it wasn't like, even after like Bloomberg became mayor and like I was too young, I didn't live this, but I think what's like kind of missing now is when, people are like, oh, like in like New York used to have a scene. It's like, well, okay. And like, it used to always have violent crime. I was like, okay, so this is a little bit different. There's crime now, but then it's also expensive. And then also the scene is gone and dispersed. So it's,
right.
You can't really just like write it off and be like, oh, this is just, one drawback to living here and being part of a creative community because everything's dispersed. I think like the 2000s is when that kind of started, not just like, people being dispersed, but then also it was a time of opportunity. Like things were popping up everywhere on the internet. There was N+1. This gallery and the book shut down, there'd be a new one next week. Right. Or, she goes to that party on the Lower East Side and she kind of talks about who she saw. And like, even though the people there sound superficial, you kind of know that they aren't like that wacko. I mean, the guy that she ends up giving her keys to and like letting him do things. It turns out that he was an artist, even though he just wanted to shock people and get a superficial reaction. Like he was at least putting in the effort, I guess.
Right. Absolutely. The way that they like kind of the fakeness of it and the how you can use that to your advantage too. Like that's something I've actually picked up on in the internet era too here with this podcast and just, trying to market it and send shit out and just not that you're trying to shock people, but just the kind of like you have to make that effort to market yourself. However, you do have to be a little bit conscious of how that's going to play out when you're marketing yourself, in these how that's going to play into your reputation. And I'm already noticing things now where people are like, oh, well, you like that a lot. And I was like, I don't. But I guess because I talked about it like, 3 or 4 episodes in a row. So people are like, oh, well, you're obsessed with this. And I'm like, well, I'm not. But, whatever. But yeah, I do want to hit beauty, especially the theme of beauty, because I think it's very important in this novel, especially like this type of kind of like careless or effortless beauty, right? Like this kind of, and then like kind of gearing that towards how it's like an asset and a burden, maybe. Or yeah, what do you think?
You're quite like, you're spot on. And in a way, like what she's talking about here, like right now we have this kind of resurgence of quiet luxury or, and I think what's really funny is that I hate the term generational wealth. I think it's vulgar. I think it reminds me a lot of socioeconomic class where people take it out of context because they feel, they feel uncomfortable or they feel insecure talking, like using, I guess, like a more like using vernacular or just saying like he's middle class, she's working class. They have to talk about like, place it in like, oh no, but because of her income and then also her social, like they have to pull a term from sociology. But I think that, it's both an asset and a burden. And here it kind of shows that, like, Reva is constantly trying to keep up, and, she's doing it as much as she can. I think that, like, that's something I related to that heavily. But I think people are always trying to chase down, especially in the literary world, just like this, when you saw it in that Lit It Girls article, like
Right.
this effortless idea. And I think after like a whole era of oversharing and, confessional pieces and books, it's starting to kind of come back into fashion. Like this is what people were reacting to before, I think, with Lena Dunham style stuff. That's why I was like, oh, like you took something different from my point. Like they didn't like the idea of these, it girls being aloof and kind of withdrawn. Even like you don't see Ottessa or Emma Klein or any of these superstars, like great writers, wade into culture war nonsense ever. Like you don't see them.
Right.
You don't see like right now, like they are partnering. Like I think Ottessa partnered with a couple of fashion labels that were very, sleek and understated. They're trying, like their brand building looks very different. And I think it's not even about, quote unquote generational wealth. I think it's the idea of putting forth an effortless facade where people might assume that about you, like to succeed now, to become one of those. And I do think it's like both a burden and both an asset. And it sounds like for this protagonist, it was like, I don't know if she's as pretty as she thinks she is, like maybe she is, but it also sounded like, it sounded like this is someone who was just like very withdrawn, and because she was gorgeous, like she assumed that was why. I don't know. Yeah.
Right. There is that, yeah, and I always talk about this. I always use the professional sports example, but it is, it's true for, I think, beauty and like being put together at the same time, where people don't like to see the effort part of it. They like to see it's sexy when it looks like you didn't try. But like so as like professional sports people are like, oh, it looks easy, but like that's incredibly hard. And these people have been working for decades to be able to do that with their bodies, like,
Yeah.
and but it looks effortless when you're watching it, and you're like, oh yeah, it's kind of like a show too. Like when you're watching a play or whatever, you don't see the part that took months, putting the sets together, the actors doing these scenes over and over again, the work that it takes, the effort. We just see the work after all that effort, the beauty after all that effort. And then we're like, oh, you don't even have to try to be beautiful. How dare you? And then we hate them for it. Like, oh, they don't deserve it or something. But I think it's also very our generation, right? Like this kind of, like, even now, the discourse, right? It's always about who's hot, right? Like the social media changed things to where people can say, everybody gets to tell you what they think right away in real time. And that includes, they get to say, ad hominem or talk about your appearance in real time. Like that can be used against you in a lot of different ways. And it just, the hyperfixation of it, like maybe we're more fixated on it now than we've ever been. Like, I don't know if that's just my bias, what I follow online, but I think it is important. And it's to this story and to really Ottessa's overall body of work too, right? Like the beauty is a big part, and I guess kind of female coded to some extent, but it's becoming more not just female either, because there's a lot of men that put a lot of effort into that, the fillers that men are getting in their faces, and hair transplants, and I do know a little bit about this, like the kind of manosphere stuff with you see these men, who's taking steroids, who isn't. Hey, would you believe there's still an extra hour of conversation left? Well, there is. And if you want to hear the full, uncensored episode, you need to subscribe at patreon.com/heavyboard, where you will receive full, uncensored episodes like this without any interruptions, ads, or anything else. And that's for subscribers only at patreon.com/heavyboard. So, what are you waiting for? Subscribe today and join the conversation.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile.
Resources.
say so. Are you radioactive, pal?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.